Welcome to Glasnost and a conversation that we want to have today with Boris Kagarlitsky. Was written quite a good deal about the Gorbachev period, about Gorbachev as a man, Gorbachev and Perestroika and Glasnost and all of the events of the 1980s, which brought down the Soviet bloc. And so I thought I would ask Boris a few questions about his attitude toward it, and perhaps we can have a little interchange about it. Boris, what do you think? Does it make sense for us to look back on this period and see Gorbachev as a revolutionary?
Well, of course not. It definitely was not a revolutionary, and he tried to be a reformer, and in many ways he failed as a reformer, though the outcome of the reforms shouldn't be just kind of judged on the basis of the failure. It's a much more complicated and complex process, because on the one hand, what we have in the case of Perestroika is that, yes, definitely we arrived to the situation where we have much more freedom, and that is very important. And I don't think that even many people who are now blaming Gorbachev for many disasters that followed his reforms are eager to go back to the situation when they were completely subordinated to the party leadership and the censorship system and so on and so on. So in that sense, the process which Gorbachev launched was in some ways, in many ways, was progressive, but also it had a very negative side, because it led to the restoration of capitalism, which most people didn't want, and that's very important. Most people in Russia, at least, or in the Soviet Union, didn't want capitalism to be restored as a result of the process. And definitely people didn't expect the Soviet Union to disintegrate. So now Gorbachev in the former Soviet Union is usually mostly associated with the disintegration of the Soviet Union as one single country, one single space, and the wars which followed, including the current war in Ukraine, can also be seen and is interpreted as one of the consequences of these events and these decisions. Though my personal point of view is that Gorbachev was not the kind of person who was leading the process. On the contrary, he was the kind of person who was kind of led by the process. He followed the process. He very much was kind of reacting to the challenges to which he often didn't have clear answers. And in a certain sense, he can be even interpreted as a tragic figure, to some extent at least.
Well, you say he's a reformer, and the reforms were in terms of this idea of perestroika, this notion of reconstruction. We have this a similar word in American history, reconstruction, to indicate what happened after the American Civil War. You know, it's not so much. I mean, there is some element of comparison with the idea of introducing from above events, reforms, but things that are very profound in their effects on the existing order. So the Gorbachev Revolution, if you think of it that way, and that was the title of my book when I wrote about it, the Gorbachev Revolution, it was an attempt to renovate society from above, you know, and it went sour. And I think the task for historians is to ask why it was that it went sour. I'm sure you were an enthusiast for it in the beginning, were you not, Boris?
Well, of course, quite a lot of people, and most people probably, were quite optimistic and enthusiastic, because after 20 plus years of so-called stagnation, zastoy, people were
But they didn't call it stagnation right away.
Yeah,
they only called it stagnation in 1987. At first it was uskorenie, remember?
No. What I'm saying that after Brezhnev.
Acceleration of the perfection of the Brezhnev regime. between
Exactly, but
1985 and 1987.
Tony,
Yeah.
let me explain.
Yeah.
After Brezhnev, people experienced about 20 years, well, 18 years of Brezhnev and a few years after Brezhnev, when actually nothing was happening for years. People were eager for change. They wanted change to happen. They didn't have a very clear idea what kind of change, but they wanted something to change. Things were really extremely boring, among other things, under Brezhnev, except for the war in Afghanistan, which was not making people much happier. And definitely it was, in the beginning, it was the time of hope, definitely the time of hope. And yes, the initial reforms were extremely limited, and they were extremely superficial, and still people were happy because they understood that something was beginning to change. And then what we discovered was that on the one hand, there were new freedoms which became available, like the freedom to travel, then more and more freedom of expression. Finally, censorship was abandoned, and that was a tremendous breakthrough. I remember myself sitting in a room with an editor of a small newspaper, and we were discussing the decision of Gorbachev, which was announced a few hours before that, to stop censorship, to liquidate the institutions of censorship. And then the editor told me, I don't know how to work now, because we are so experienced, we are so competent in working with and against the censorship. It's kind of
dependent on it.
Undermining our traditional way of operating, because we knew how to overcome censorship, and now we don't know how to express ourselves when there is no censorship. And we were both just discussing how we're going to work it right now after the censorship was dismantled. So there were quite a few interesting experiences. So in that sense, the initial years of Gorbachev were definitely very positive. But let's be very clear, Gorbachev lost the control very, very fast. And the reforms were very late, actually. The reforms were more or less designed theoretically and conceptually in the 1960s. And well, they were not timely. They were postponed for about 20 years, and when they finally started to be implemented, they were kind of outdated, and they didn't fit the situation which was developing was current in the Soviet Union by that time. The social, psychological, political, moral, and so on situation was different. And well, I think Gorbachev had very vague and very unclear idea of what to do and where to go next, except for some few very basic ideas about, well, letting people to have somewhat more freedom, and let's have the economy being a little bit more dynamic, more flexible. Well, once he lost control over the situation, the whole thing started disintegrating, as we know.
I see we have Bryan with us, so why don't I turn things over to Bryan? And our original idea here was for him to moderate the meeting, but things have got a little tangled here, but I think we can continue. Bryan, do you want to take over?
How's it going?
Hi.
Yeah. Hi. How you doing? Good morning. Yeah. I mean, have you already spoken, Tony?
No.
No. Okay. Well,
maybe you have some. Boris has been speaking, so maybe you have some questions to ask Boris about this.
Yeah. You know, I mean, I think that the main question, there's a number of questions I had, but I mean, to keep it brief, the main question that I wanted to bring up was, there's this Gorbachev is this kind of contradictory figure. On the one hand, a true believer, one of the final true believers in the Soviet project, you might say, who believed that it could reform itself from the inside, and bestowing upon the Soviet people these like sort of idealistic projects of perestroika and glasnost. And it seems pretty clear that they failed. And I think that a lot of people ask this question, where did he go wrong? Was there something in perestroika and glasnost themselves were, faulty from the beginning, or was it their implementation that undermined their goals?
Well, as I told you before, I think the whole project was late because in the 1960s, Soviet society was still somewhat dynamic, and there was some kind of popular enthusiasm about the Soviet project. Some sort of perestroika from below would have been possible in the 1960s with the previous experience of ottepel, the thaw, the period when reforms from above also were met with enormous enthusiasm within the society, not without contradictions also, but the general process was comprehensive and involved much of the society. And in their 1980s, it was already a different society, which was very much automized, cynical, consumerist also, among other things. And the only organized force within the society by then was the very same bureaucracy, nomenclatura, the party and economic bureaucracy, which during Brezhnev years also became very corrupt. So in that sense, the only organized and consolidated force was exactly the conservative force, which suddenly discovered that reforms were at the same time providing it with a lot of new opportunities, but these opportunities were connected with the destruction of the Soviet project and the Soviet state, because then they said, okay, if we are not going to run the system the old way, we're going to do something to benefit from its disintegration, and we're going to loot it, and it's also a good project. And so in that sense, the looters are becoming the dominant force of the society, while all other social groups were disorganized, passive, and also politically confused.
Boris, that actually sort of leads into a secondary part of this question, which is, some historians try to place the end of the USSR as sort of an extension of structural problems, while others try to blame either the political reforms initiated by Gorbachev or the political decision of the elites in the Russian Soviet Socialist Federated Republic to, make the political decision to withdraw from the Union as a conscious political choice. And I'm curious, in your own reading of this kind of end of the USSR, do you view it more as kind of a structural problem or a conscious political decision?
Well, I think there was a bit of both, because structural problems preceded the disintegration, and disintegration didn't happen just because a few people wanted Soviet Union to disintegrate. I think, well, as you understand, events of that level, of that scale, don't happen just because a few guys, even at the top of the government, wanted such things to happen. And also the very idea that they started wanting that, the very fact that they started wanting that, also didn't come without any reasons, without any grounds. So in that sense, I'm pretty sure that in the long run, the disaster was inevitable because Soviet Union was in a very deep crisis, and it failed to reform itself along the lines of democratic socialism. It failed to reform itself already in the 1960s. So in that sense, as I told you, the defeat, the failure of the reforms in the 60s was, as now we know, we didn't know that in the 1980s, but now we know that for sure, that was actually the final defeat. We thought it was not, but it was the final defeat. What was happening was that also society became extremely cynical and demoralized after 20 years of so-called stagnation and Brezhnev and Chernenko and Andropov and so on. So in that sense, it's very logical that it happened this way. On the other hand, it doesn't mean that nobody bears responsibility for the actual political decisions. And I think it's very clear somebody made political decisions. There were people who made political decisions so that things happened exactly the way they happened, not any other way. And there could have been other options, other scenarios which could have been better, somewhat better at least. And the main thing to understand is that privatization is the central issue here, because once they decided to privatize companies, enterprises, resources, the union was doomed, because among other aspects of privatization, it was also the need to disintegrate, to split one country into pieces, so that privatization process in different territories would have been managed by different elite groups, which were also involved in organizing this kind of transition to capitalism, caring about their own specific interests, personal and group interests. So in that sense, they saw the destruction of the union as the way to avoid more conflict around resource, the division of resources, well, privatization options, and so on and so on. So like dividing the spheres of interest, the spheres of influence between different bureaucratic groups, that was a central issue. And destroying the union was, as they saw that, the way to do that peacefully and in an organized, controlled way.
And so Tony, I mean, you wrote a book about Gorbachev. You've been teaching Soviet history in the United States, and been, the name of this show is even Glasnost, in kind of homage to Gorbachev. And he's a very controversial figure, as we've been discussing here, and given his pivotal role politically in the facilitation of the end of the USSR. And my question to you is, I want to start with the question of, how did you observe the emergence of perestroika and glasnost from the vantage point of the United States towards the end of the Cold War? How did it look from where you were sitting?
Well, the way it was advertised in the West, Gorbachev said that the main thing was that he was going to end the antagonism between East and West, and it was going to end the Cold War. And one of the ways to remove the Soviet threat, he said, was to change the Soviet Union. And one of the ways to convince the West that the changes that were going on in the Soviet Union were genuine was to actually make them genuine. And so you could say that there was new thinking about the Cold War, arms control on the basis not of parity, but of reasonable sufficiency. In fact, a turn, and Gorbachev deserves credit for this, a turn toward real disarmament in 1987, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty that got rid of Euromissiles in Europe. That was disarmament, and it went beyond arms control. So Gorbachev is a tremendous figure from the standpoint, the diplomatic standpoint, of making peace with the United States and ending the Cold War. But the transfer of from Stalinism, that was difficult. And they did it by way of Bukharin and the revival of the idea of the NEP. And the notion of the NEP turned into a myth, in effect, and it made possible all sorts of illusions about privatization that probably wouldn't have been in place otherwise. And Andropov was interested in the NEP. And Andropov was interested in the Chinese reforms, and he talked about them in terms of the NEP. And so they ended up with an ideology of the NEP, the Bukharin alternative. And so they said that Stalinism would never have resulted if they had continued with the NEP. It became an elaborate argument against the collectivization of agriculture and all of the rest of that. So it became a recasting of Soviet history. That's not tragic exactly. And I think this was very naive about Bukharin. They had the notion of Bukharin as some kind of a saint, not the case at all. But to rehabilitate Bukharin made sense. And they rehabilitated all the other victims of the purges in the 30s. Zinoviev and Trotsky in a very minor tone, and Bukharin in a very major tone. They made a big thing of Bukharin and how terrible it was that Stalin had got rid of Bukharin. I see a little residual anti-Semitism in this attitude toward the party right back in the 30s, as opposed to the party left, the people in Leningrad around Zinoviev and Kamenev, and of course, the most troublesome figure, Trotsky himself. So that was the way they started to revise ideology in 1987. And in 1988, there was a reaction against it, and Nina Andreeva offered an article in which she denounced all of these revisions of the ideology, and she defended Stalinism in a pretty unreconstructed form. The reaction to that was, I think, what ruined the whole project of a peaceful transformation of the communist system and a reform of it in terms of an honest rendering of the communist ideology of the 20s. A return to Lenin, as Gorbachev liked to think of it. The reaction was the reaction to Madame Andreeva, because they didn't take up the question she raised. In fact, all she did was blanch at the whole thing. And so they didn't take up the questions, and all they did was act administratively against their opponents from this point on. So in 1988 and 89, they got rid of Gromyko, they got rid of Ligachev. Now, Ligachev represented collective leadership and some kind of a limit on Gorbachev. And so Gorbachev developed the idea that he was going to rise above the party, and that, you know, the Leninist norms of collective leadership at the top. And he was going to become a, you know, singular figure. He's going to be elected to boot. So the ambitions that he harbored were totally out of proportion. What's more, he didn't have any conception of the preservation of the Soviet state when it was suggested to him that they form a new union in order to placate the feelings of the Union republics. He said, splendid, and embarked on the process of destroying the state that he had been elected to rule, that he'd been chosen to rule. These are some of the reasons. It's a very complicated process, and as Boris says, I think it's very sharp what Boris says, that the way it happened is pretty much the way it had to happen. It was not something that was going to happen one way or another. It had to happen the way it did happen. But anyhow, those are some of the building blocks of an explanation, I think. Boris will have his own thoughts about this.
Well, again, when we are talking about such events, it's very important to see that there are two sides. One side is that there is an objective process, and there are objective preconditions for that to happen, and there is a logic. On the other hand, it doesn't make us accept anything happening. It doesn't make us say, well, nobody is responsible because it had to happen this way. Because people have to be responsible for their actions, for their decisions. They made decisions, even though, of course, these decisions were preconditioned by previous events, by the balance of forces, by the ideology, and so on, so on, so on. However, they're responsible for what they have done and said, and so on. So in that sense, I think that Gorbachev has to bear the blame for much of what happened, but he was a weak man, actually. I think he happened to be much weaker than he himself expected, maybe. Because, what is very interesting about Gorbachev is that he was an extremely competent bureaucrat within the apparatus. He knew how to fight against intrigues within the apparatus when he had some political adversaries and rivals within the bureaucracy. So all these bureaucratic games he really mastered. But he was not a politician, or at least not a strong politician. So being a political leader and being a competent bureaucrat, these are two very different things.
In many ways, he was the worst political leader of the 20th century.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. That's exactly what
no one has as bad a record as he in terms of the statecraft.
Exactly, that's what I'm saying. So being a competent apparatchik, knowing how to deal with intrigues within the apparatus is one thing. Leading a country as a political leader is a totally different thing. So in that sense, now we can see to which extent apparatchik can become dangerous once he becomes the political figure. Well, by the way, we have plenty of these people everywhere in the world these days. It's not only Gorbachev. We have plenty of such figures around the world who are very competent within the party bureaucracy, within the party apparatus, and so on, who don't have the capacity to be real leaders. Not only in Russia, in the West as well, and it's very dangerous, I think.
I've been reading this new book by historian Vladislav Zubok, Collapse, which is quite good, but it's a scathing critique of Gorbachev. And, in his book, the way that he frames it is that Gorbachev is sort of overwhelmed with like a naivete because of his idealism, that basically what you guys just said prevent him from being a proper statesman. And so I guess in terms of thinking about that element of Gorbachev, he's holding on to the ideals of the Soviet system that can't be actualized through it. And it seems to me that there were at the time that perestroika and glasnost are being implemented, this leads into the next point I wanted to make, which was you start to have outside of Russia, other areas of the Soviet Union start to sort of try and actualize what they view are the ideals of the USSR that can't really be formally actualized given the structure of the system. And so, for example, whether that's the national demands of the Karabakh Armenians, or you start to have tensions between Abkhazia and Georgia, where elites and intelligentsia start to use Leninist ideals, similar Leninist ideals that Gorbachev is enamored with, to try to sort of make a political demand. And so, I guess, like, how do you, both of you, this is a question to both of you, sort of this return to Lenin and the ideals that the Soviet system is supposedly based on, but those ideals unable to be actualized. Is that something that was endemic to the Soviet system since, Lenin died? Or is this a product of like a degradation that happened somewhere later?
Well, let me say one thing, that we have to understand that the society of the Soviet Union was very much was very different. If we compare the 20s with the 1980s, for example, the society evolved. Actually, ethnic and national identities evolved. And because on the one hand, there was this tendency of the integration of everyone into one Soviet people. On the other hand, there was a conscious development of ethnic intelligence and ethnic bureaucracy. And there was a kind of hierarchy within different republics with different statuses for different ethnic and national groups, which was also operating in a bureaucratic way. And that was a real time bomb, which blew up, as we know. And that time bomb was very much created, ironically, by the very Leninist policies, because the Leninist policies of positive discrimination were not so bad for their time, because Lenin made it very clear. Some ethnic groups and some nations or peoples of the former Russian Empire were discriminated, were suppressed in their ethnic and cultural demands, and they were victims of oppression for years and centuries. So we have to correct that with a system of positive discrimination. And that was pretty reasonable in the beginning, but there is a problem here, because once you have this system of positive discrimination institutionalized and bureaucratized, it's becoming a completely different thing, because it is becoming a system which generates new statuses and which generates opportunities and life chances and career chances linked to some ethnic statuses and so on, formal ethnic statuses. So that creates a lot of contradictions. And then what you get is a competition of statuses, because these statuses and these statuses of positive discrimination were also contradictory. Like in one republic, say in Azerbaijan, you have the positive discrimination of Azeris, and in Armenia you have the same thing for the Armenians, and what to do with Armenians in Azerbaijan, what to do with the Azeris in Armenia, who were also present, by the way. We often forget that it was not only about Armenians in Azerbaijan, who were quite a few, but there were also Azeris in Armenia, not so many, but they were present there. The conflict between Tatars and Bashkirs in Tatarstan and Bashkortostan. What about Russians who were present everywhere? What about Jews who seem to be discriminated against almost everywhere, but at the same time, sometimes had positive chances in vis-a-vis some other ethnic groups and so on. So all that created a very mixed and complicated and contradictory system, which was getting increasingly chaotic. So in that sense, yes, there was a heritage of the Leninist policies, but let's be very clear. It's not that the policies were wrong from the very beginning. Just the big problem is often things that work for some time, for some period, for some situation. They don't work when the situation changes, and it very often changes exactly because of these policies. They did change the situation, then they had to be abandoned, but they didn't. They were not abandoned. They were strengthened, on the contrary. And why? It's also logical, because you generate new special interests through these policies, like positive discrimination. At some point, you have to drop it, but at this point, you have people who are totally interested in these policies to continue, and so on and so on. So there were plenty of contradictions which were inherited, and we cannot blame Gorbachev for these contradictions, but we have to blame Gorbachev for not trying to resolve these contradictions, or at least not trying to develop adequate responses for these to these challenges.
You know, I have a couple of more footnotes. I was thinking about Leninism and about the attempt to go back to Lenin. It had a big effect in the United States, at least temporarily, because Ronald Reagan made a study of the matter and his own style of study of the matter. He consulted with Susan Massey, who wrote Nicholas and Alexandra. And at the end of it, she somehow ended up convincing him that the Gorbachev reforms were an attempt to go back to Lenin, and that the thing that they had been opposed to was Stalin, Reagan thought, and Gorbachev was going back to Lenin, and so that was probably a good thing. Immediately he was criticized. The Washington Post wrote an editorial against Reagan saying, didn't he know that Stalin and Lenin, they were pretty much the same thing. And once you say Lenin, you say Stalin. You know, it's all pretty much the same thing. You know, Stalin was Lenin's greatest pupil, and all of the rest. That's the American doctrine of totalitarianism, that you had a continuity of a tyranny right from the beginning of the Russian Revolution. And Reagan dropped that idea. He opposed that idea quite adamantly at the time. So you could say that was a kind of an interesting element there, that a conquest in a certain sense, an ideological conquest that Gorbachev made of Ronald Reagan himself. And then I was also thinking about Suslov and his notions of the stability of the collective leadership at the top, the so-called stabilization of cadres. He said that was a Leninist norm. That is not entirely wrong. You know, in Lenin's day, he ran the Politburo in that way. He was certainly not a person that they were afraid of, and a person who could order their arrest or anything like that. It was a completely different affair. So then you could say that they were Leninist norms, and if that's the case, then Gorbachev absolutely violated them, threw them aside carelessly. And then lastly, Putin's point about how the federal structure of the Soviet Union was a time bomb. There's something to that idea, that it's a time bomb. In other words, it's a whole structure that gives an indication of the form in which the country can fall apart. And we have the same thing in the United States with our federal structure. It indicates, in a way, how the country can fall apart, the mechanisms, the institutional mechanisms for the country falling apart. And that's indicated in our Civil War, and it's something we're thinking about now when we think about the return of a civil war. So in many ways, there's a kind of a similarity between the history of the two countries, at least in that rather broad sense. So Bryan, you want to do the honors and break things off? Do you have anything to say in conclusion?
I mean, it's a massive topic, but I would just say that, thanks for coming on and having a nice conversation about, these things. I think that, we could probably discuss this endlessly, but given the current events that are going on, I think it's very important to see how this, just like you said, this collapse of the Soviet Union is not bloodless as it is continuing to happen, or you still seeing the after effects. So on that note, see you guys later.
Yeah. Yeah.